12th century to to the end of our period. So things like Roman cooking and Norse cooking, that is not something I am very well versed in. So this class will focus on medieval Renaissance Western Europe. A lot of it can be for me. It's easy to research that when you make the link. And everyone can see my slideshow, correct?
Yes, I can see it. Thank you.
So the things that went into determining what people ate and how people ate, there are a couple different factors. There's socioeconomic factors, your class, how much money you had, which was really the same thing during most of our period, had a huge influence on what you ate. People had the natural reasons and seasonal changes affected things to a great degree. You couldn't get out of season food. You had to preserve it, or you had to wait around until it was season again. Religious restrictions had a huge impact on what people ate. Until the Reformation, most of Europe, especially Western Europe, was Catholic, and the Catholic Church ruled everything in what you ate. There was also legal factors. There were laws that reflected what people had available to them, and then there were foods that just simply weren't available in Europe yet.
Work for the bosses.
And then also in the natural and the seasonal, we have these scientific theories on what was healthier to eat.
When I was 16, I was taking thousands of pounds worth of drugs across the border into Hong Kong.
I apologize. There seems to be someone playing video of like a show or something. If we could get that muted, I do apologize. So we do have socioeconomic factors that went into it. Most people were very poor, and they lived in simple houses with a central hearth. They may only have one or two cook pots to do all their cooking in. So if you've only got, a simple cook stove or a simple cook pot, if you only have one or two, or you have to cook on stones on a hearth, it's a lot harder to prepare elaborate meals. If you had two pots and you were a peasant, so you're very much limited. The higher the more complex your kitchen setup. So if you were in a town, or if you were in a manor, you'd have access to more complex things. If you had a townhouse, for instance, you would have perhaps more than one cook fire. You would have an oven that you can access. And we're going to have some pictures of this going along. Most people ate bread and pottage on a daily basis for most of history. Bread was such a mainstay in medieval food and in medieval life. It fulfilled so much of people's caloric needs. It had protein. But the problem with bread is a lot of times you would have to pay to ground the grain, or you would have to use the manor or the town's grinder, and you'd have to have that privilege. And if you didn't have access to an oven, you would have to pay to have that baked as well. So one thing you could cook on your own is pottage. And pottage really is just anything you throw in a pot. If you had a little bit of meat, if you had vegetables, if you had any type of herbs or spices or anything like that, you combine everything in a pot and you can cook it that way. Another really excellent thing about cooking pottage or cooking over in a stew is water and stewing and boiling is extremely fuel conservative. you need less fuel to boil than you do to bake. And believe it or not, fuel was a real issue in medieval times because you couldn't just go out and pick up wood all the time. There were actually laws around that. When you think about bread, it's kind of backwards than we have today. Right now, the cheap bread is the Wonder Bread. It's the cheap white bread. Well, period. Making white bread is extremely, extremely hard. It's something that I've tried to do before. I've actually ground my own flour and sifted it to make flour for pies. It is amazingly labor intensive. So the whiter your bread is, the more expensive. And we're talking prohibitively expensive. And even then, white bread isn't really the white that we think about because they didn't bleach their flour. So their white bread is really our refined wheat bread. And the brown and the poor ate brown bread. So what they would have is bread that had all the bran in it, if it was wheat bread at all. They had bread made out of rye. They had bread made out of pulses, which would be like legumes and peas and things of that nature, barley, oat, rye. And the poorer you are, the more coarse your bread would be. Do we have any questions so far? Okay. So dairy is very important. It could be preserved and it provides animals. If you get your hands on meat or on milk, you can turn it into butter, you can turn it into cheese. If you salted butter and cheese, it would keep. Dairy could be a source of animal fats that would sustain you if you didn't have access to any other sources of it. It was referred to as white meat. It was extremely, extremely ubiquitous throughout the region, especially preserved dairy. Not so much drinking of milk, but changing it into butter, changing it into cheese. Believe it or not, fresh fish could be extremely expensive depending on when and where you ate or you lived. So most times it's filtered fish or eel. Freshwater eel was pretty much everywhere, especially in England because of all the waterways. Most meat was very expensive. Well, they have a chance. Or duck, or goose. To lay eggs, and you can eat those eggs. But once you kill and you eat that fowl, you don't have access to those eggs anymore. So they really didn't kill their poultry to eat if you're poor until they're in its life. If you had an ox, you needed that ox to work your land. So if you killed and you ate that ox, you wouldn't have access to that labor anymore. And without that labor, you're not going to get your cereal, and you're not going to get your, you're not going to get anything like that. The same thing with lamb. If you raised sheep, it was way more valuable for wool than it was for a meat. So once again, you would kill that near the end of its life. Pigs, however, pigs are magic. You can feed a pig kitchen scraps and it makes bacon. Pigs could also be raised in towns, some of these other beasts of burdens which couldn't be raised in towns. Now, meat was certainly available, but it was expensive because it was a little bit more rare. So if you're at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale, you have far less access to meat than you would at the top. Obviously, the very top of the gentry and the nobility, certainly they could afford meat. You know, a duke could afford all the meat he wanted, but a tenant farmer, not so much. Towns and cities would also, they had fast food. They had soup shops, pot shops. You can go in if you can get a bowl of pottage. You can get a side of something. these cities and these towns, a lot of these houses, these tenements really wouldn't have kitchens. So you'd have to go out and eat. So this is a drawing of the inside of a home of a typical medieval peasant. So as you see, they had a central hearth, they have a cook fire, and that is where they cook their food in. They didn't have an oven. Now, there is a way that you can bake by using basically a pot, and you can turn the pot over and put coals on top of it. And it kind of works kind of well. I managed to cook a cake that way a couple of years ago for Queen's Prize, which is something Palantir does for an arts and science competition. So if you can see it, you see up on top, they would hang their food stores. And they had this thing right here, that bench or that box-looking thing beyond the cook pot, that's a grain ark. Grain arks are really interesting. What you would do is you would store your grain inside the ark, and if you flipped it over, a lot of times the inside lid would be a dough trough, and that's where you would work it out. That's a really fascinating thing. If you watch a video called Secrets of Castle, you can see that in use. So in these cities and towns, you'd also have a portable oven. So this is an example of a baker in a town having a portable oven. It would be on wheels, and they would go and they would, you can bring your food to this oven, they would bake it for you, or you can just buy hot pies. You've got pretzels at the top, you've got pies here. This is really fascinating that this kind of existed so early. So this is a reconstruction of a kitchen in a manor. So as you can see, they've got ovens, they've got more surfaces, they've got prep table. This kitchen, now this is actually a Tudor kitchen as well, so it is a little bit later on. But when you have access to greater kitchens, you can obviously create much more elaborate food. You can create less fuel economical food. Because as you can see, you've got this one roaring fire, but they have multiple spits in front of it.
There was a question in the chat and also a commentary. You are picking up a little bit, and someone had a question about how the baker did not burn up.
The ovens that they bake bread in, you would it would be stone, and they would start a fire in it. And then once it reached temperature, they'd break out all the coals and then cook food inside of it.
Okay, I think I got that.
So as the calendar moves forward, what is available changes over the year. So in fall or in winter, you would have access to turnips and apples and cabbages. In the spring and the summer, it would change. In the summer, you'd have brown beans and things of that nature. So what's in your pot, even if you are limited to just having bread and pottage, that would change throughout the year. So as time went on, your dish would be completely different. Now, obviously, you can preserve foods and, add that in as well. In the spring, if you're going to make cheese, you would have to slaughter a ruminant animal, a calf or a lamb, to make rennet, which is what used to make cheese. So you would have access to those fresh meats, and then you would salt and preserve those for later on in the year as well. A lot of times older animals would be slaughtered in the fall or in November. So you would have access to those throughout the winter because they were just too expensive to keep throughout the winter if they're at the end of their life anyways. The Catholic Church had huge amount of influence on what people ate and when people ate. In general, through certain parts of Europe and certain parts of the calendar, you wouldn't be able to have meat on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. There was no meat, dairy, eggs, in Lent or Advent. So about half the calendar year, you couldn't eat meat. Not following these church dietary laws could lead to fines, imprisonment, but there were ways to get around it. We have the example of the barnacle goose. So the barnacle goose does show up in a couple of herbals. And people believed, or at least they pretended to believe, that the barnacle geese were fruits, or barnacle geese were fish, because they hatched out of barnacles or they came from a tree. They would also get around it by saying, oh, well, a beaver lives in water, so a beaver tail is fish. Now, whether or not these people actually believed a barnacle goose was a fish or was a fruit is questionable, but they used it as an excuse to eat this during Lent. In fact, one of the popes in the early 1200s actually decreed that you can't eat a barnacle goose during Lent because it looks like a duck, and therefore to meat like for Lent. Now, he didn't actually come out and say a barnacle goose is meat, but he did try to put a stop to it. And this is just one example of some of these ways to circumvent it. So the law would also restrict what you could and couldn't eat. So in England, especially, 13th, 14th century, most bodies of water were owned by the church, the gentry, and nobility. So the lakes and the rivers, you would have to buy the rights to fish on, or you would have to own it. So we're in this country that has these river fish everywhere, and they may be too expensive to eat because you don't have the legal right to fish, so all the rich are buying up the fresh fish, so you're ended up with the salted fish. Forests would also be owned with the church, by the church, the gentry, or the nobility. So even if you were a tenant farmer, you would have in your lease agreement, it would tell you what your rights are to the forest. You could go and you could collect this amount of wood, or you could go for this amount of time and collect wood. And so you would be restricted to how much fuel you had. You would also be restricted to how many outbuildings, because you had to be able to have the wood to build it and things of that nature. So you actually had to ration forests. And before the Black Death, deforestation actually became a real issue in medieval Europe, because if you think about it, it's your fuel, it's your building material, you build ships from it. So it was very much a problem. So you also couldn't hunt and fish in these you couldn't hunt and fish in these forests as well. Like poaching was a real big deal. If you were caught poaching, that would have some serious fines, or you could be put to death. I mean, it depends on the country, it depends on the time. But you couldn't just go into the forest and catch a deer and eat a deer. That was a fairly big deal. When you get towards the Reformation, when you get towards the end of period, you actually start seeing this really interesting increase in sumptuary laws that controlled how much people can eat and what people can eat. Now, obviously during the Reformation, you have this break, and you've got Catholic countries, you have Protestant countries. These sumptuary laws are found in both countries, or both Protestant and Catholic countries. But the Catholics tended to try to contain what animals you ate, whereas the Protestants tended to contain the amount of food you can have. And it's this really interesting divide.
So I've got a couple examples of these sumptuary laws. So France, which would be a Catholic country, outlawed eating of lamb and beef. Now, obviously, these sumptuary laws were put on the books, and they weren't on the books forever. Some of these were, overturned within 10, 15 years. Some of them were overturned the next several decades or the next several centuries. Milan banned the consumption of roe deer, peacocks, and pheasants. It's interesting that in England, and this is one of the very first sumptuary laws in England, and until the beginning of the Reformation, it was one of the only ones on the books. You could eat these exotic fowl, but you could only have one dish of them. In Venice, you couldn't have wild animals like wild birds, and Indian cocks and hens were banned from the diet. So it's interesting because they're saying you can't have these really interesting fowl, or you can't have these red meats, versus an example in Calvinist era Scotland. And Tudor, Elizabeth in England had very similar rules. In any particular meal or any particular feast, it would say you would only have 8 meat dishes if you were an earl or a bishop or an archbishop. And it kind of goes down the line. If you were a lord prior or a dean, you could have 6 meat dishes. A baron or a freeholder is allowed 4 meat dishes, whereas a burgher, which is kind of a wealthy middle-class city dweller, could have 3 dishes total. They could be all meat or they can be, a mixture. So they didn't say what you could eat, but they said this is how much you're allowed to eat. And of course, sumptuary laws in a large way were laws put in place so people didn't get kind of out of their box. If you're of a certain social class, you have to act like you're part of that social.
We just lost your audio again when you said if you're of a certain social class, you have to act as if you're that social class, and then it cut off.
Okay, so basically the sumptuary laws are to kind of keep people in their box. And it's very interesting in the beginning when the Reformation comes around, how many sumptuary laws when it comes to food really came up. So,
did the sumptuary laws apply equally to everyone? So, for example, in France, you cited that they weren't able to have beef or lamb. Was that true across all of the social strata, or just everyone below a certain rank?
That I'm not 100% sure of. Obviously, if you had enough money, if you're a higher enough class, you can buy indulgences, or you could, run a higher risk of breaking the law. If you were super poor, no one really cared what you ate. If you're a peasant farmer, you could pretty much, you couldn't afford to have all these sumptuous things. You couldn't afford to have all of these dishes. And so you tended not to have too much attention paid to that. Now, in these Catholic countries, these laws were enacted because they felt like these red meats were bad for your soul. So you would run the risk of ruining yourself medievally or religiously. So I would imagine that would be across social classes. But obviously, the more rich and powerful you are, the more you can get away with breaking the law. That's true then, that's true now, unfortunately.
Thank you.
So,
sorry, if I could ask on that, just jumping off of that point, and I don't know if this was intentional or not, but I'm noticing in the lists in the Catholic countries of the meats that are banned, those almost without fail are universally meats that would fall within an allowance for kosher. And certainly at the same time, we're talking about parallel with the Inquisition in Spain, and many Jewish dietary practices of that period we have documented because of inquisitorial court records. Basically, the way people ate outed them as not being Catholic. And so I'm wondering if there's any overlap in that, because very prominently pork, which if you're Jewish, you would not be consuming, if you're Jewish or Muslim, frankly. So these groups that are in the process of being cast out of Western European society, very, very at odds with the dietary laws that we're seeing here.
You know, that is fascinating, and I wouldn't be surprised if that was a part of that. That is something I'm definitely going to have to explore. I'm afraid I don't have the answer to that, but I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't have a lot to do with that. So thank you. So if you were trying to put together a medieval diet, there are some foods that simply weren't available in period. Now, when you start getting closer to the end of period, if you get closer to the 16th century, if you're later on, some of these foods do start becoming available. Some of them were known. They were just thought to be toxic. They're very rare. For instance, there is a documented instance where Queen Elizabeth was fed a sweet potato. It was this amazing new wonder food that came over from the New World, and well, not wonder food, but this, amazing new food, and it was just kind of a look what we brought you, Your Majesty, kind of thing. But in general, the foods on this list are more New World, and they were not widely available in most of our period. So some of the really common ones that are surprising to people are things like tea. England is known for tea. However, now obviously in the Orient they had tea, but it really didn't catch on until past our period. Coffee really didn't catch on until past our period. Obviously there are pockets that had them earlier. Spain and Portugal had some of these foods earlier than others because they've colonized the New World. Things like green beans. If you look in some Roman recipes, they talk about green beans. They're not talking about American green beans that we think of, like the snap peas or anything like that. They're usually talking about fava beans.
So there's some good commentary going on in the chat, just so you're aware, about the fact of what is period. Also depends a lot on what culture you're talking about. A lot
Correct.
of the foods on your list are period if you're looking at the Middle East, if you're looking at the Far East, as opposed to the Central European area.
Absolutely.
And that they were going period, just not to the area that you're discussing in specific today.
And yes, that is important to that is important to remember. Once again, this class does focus on Europe. So absolutely, these New World foods are obviously available in the New World. Some of these foods are available elsewhere. But another big thing is turkey. They absolutely had fowl, but the turkeys we eat are New World. So those big turkey legs you get at the Renaissance Fair, not so much. Now, some of these do, like I said, become very much introduced later on. Okay. So another huge part of how people ate, and especially the higher classes, and especially in the Renaissance, was the introduction of humors. Now, humors have been around since ancient times, and during certain times in the medieval period, they kind of had they rise in popularity, and then they'd kind of fall off, and then they'd rise again, and they had a resurgence in the Renaissance. So the humoral theory was introduced by the father of modern medicine, and I always say his name wrong, but Hippocrates. And he concluded that health was influenced by four humors or body fluid that range from cold to hot to moist to dry. His student built upon the Hippocratic school of thought, which is Galen. And he was a personal physician to one of the Roman emperors. And so you talk about these Galenic teachings. And a lot of what has been attributed to Galen, there are theories that perhaps this was some of his students later on. But this whole school of thought has been very popular throughout the medieval period. And so we are going to talk about some of the humors. So the first humor you have is blood. It is hot and moist. Sanguine. And it means bloody to this day. So people who were sanguine were thought to be boisterous, bubbly, chatty, ruddy people. I would thought to be sanguine because of kind of my bubbly personality, and I have a touch of rosacea, and it makes my cheeks red and stuff like that. It is the most abundant fluid that is found in the body. So these humors, they had all these charts saying, you know, this humor was associated with adolescence and spring and directions and certain foods. And they said, you know, they had this huge list of things that your humors could be stuck with or associated with. And it's really interesting. So they believed food had an effect on your humors. So if you wanted to increase your blood, you would eat onions, you would eat parsnips, ginger, turnips, olive oil, wheat, long pepper, chickpeas, lamb.
Of like your source?
You cut out just after the word lamb. And again, a reminder, if you're not the speaker, please keep your mic on mute.
Rid of some of your blood. I mean, obviously there was blood. But you could eat things like mushrooms and lentils and millet and peas and things of that nature. Your next one would be phlegm.
Again, I apologize. You were cutting in and out again.
We've lost you again.
Live to please others. People would be pale. They'd have a washed out color. Phlegm was associated.
The majority of this slide because your audio is cut out completely.
Okay, I don't know what the issue is. The last class was having no issues. Okay, so thank you for letting me know. So phlegm was thought to be cold and moist. People with an excess of phlegm were languid. They were thought to be meek and submissive. They were introverts. There was a quarter as much phlegm as there was blood. They were pale, waterish, and they had washed out color. If you wanted to increase your phlegm, you would eat things like apples and spinach and pork. And if you wanted to decrease, you would have really hot, dry things like garlic and mustard. So the next one is cholera or yellow bile. It is hot and dry. People with an excess of yellow bile have a quick-tempered, angry temperament. They were proud, extroverted, angry people who like to dominate. They're kind of yellowish tints, like really kind of jaundiced. And yellow bile is only 1/16 as much in the blood. If you want to increase your cholera, you would eat things like, again, the hot, dry things, garlic, mustard, fennel, things of that nature. And to decrease it, you would have wet, cool things like apples and spinach and pork. So for black bile and melancholy, that is cold and dry. This was the least amount that was found in the blood. Only in tiny amounts, or in the body, only about 1/64 as much as blood. People with an excess of black bile They would have a sad temperament. Melancholy is still, a word for sad to this day. They would have dark, sunken eyes. If you want to increase it, you'd eat things like mushrooms and peas and goat. And if you want to decrease it, you would have things like ginger and chicken and parsnips. So,
For the
what?
last one question.
Mhm.
Has there been any studies that you're aware of on how those foods may or may not have actually impacted depression? Because that would have been associated there.
But that is an interesting thought. So it's really interesting how they pick.
And obviously, if you look at a different herbal, one herbal is going to list something as being hot and dry, and the next herbal may list something as being, hot and wet. So it really depends on who and when you talk to. But that is interesting. I mean, obviously, I know generally if you follow good health guidelines, if you eat a balanced diet, if you get a lot of fruits and vegetables, you feel better physically, so then you would feel better mentally. So,
I do have a quick question, if you don't mind.
No, not at all.
You just were saying that with the different herbal books that you would look at, they assign different humors to each food. What was your actual source for the last couple slides?
So my actual source, I found a lot of that from a book called Eating Right in the Renaissance, and I've actually got I've got that sourced here in my bibliography, which I'll share.
Oh, thank you.
So I kind of just, and actually I've got a chart that I'm going to show you here in a few minutes, and that's what I took that chart from. And it was Eating Right in the Renaissance, Health and Healing in the Medieval Garden. And so I just kind of picked one, and I stuck with it. So, and a lot of them, like everyone agreed that garlic is hot. So things of that nature. But some of them are interesting. There are some herbals that say bread was a humoral neutral food, which kind of makes sense, but wheat wasn't, which is kind of odd.
That is really interesting. Thank you.
So the humoral makeup of food was determined on what it does to the body, not just physical characteristics. So if you go back, you'll see some of these meats were cold. Even if you serve that meat hot, it's still cold. It would be like the color, the taste, and how much body weight was produced. Vinegars were dry. Even though vinegar is a liquid, because when you eat it, your mouth puckers and your mouth waters, they thought it was a dry food. They also would say if the animal has this temperament, its meat has the humor that matched that temperament. One interesting thing is they thought if you were sick, and this is in Galenic teaching, that a pig's flesh was the closest to human flesh, and so if you're sick, you need to sustain yourself with something as close to you as possible. So you should eat pig's meat, and you can eat pork, which luckily pork was everywhere. And it would be more nutritious, you can digest more of it. Now, not every food was equally hot and equally dry. So you would have food that was hot and dry to the first degree, or it would be wet in the second degree, but it would be cold in the third degree. And this is a lovely chart here in a few minutes that I'll show you that kind of mapped everything out. So they believed that your stomach was a cauldron and your body needed to work to produce heat to cook the food that you ate. So depending on your social class is depending on what people fed you, even if you could afford it. If you were a laborer, that meant you worked really hard and your body produced so much heat. So if you ate something highly processed, your body would burn it up immediately and you wouldn't get anything out of it. So if you had
You've cut out again. Right after you said if you ate things that were highly processed.
and that's actually kind of true. If you've got a long day and you're very active and all you eat is some junk food, you're going to be hungry, tired, and grouchy at the end of the day. On the reverse side, if you were rich and you didn't do very much physical labor, if you were just given a hunk of brown bread and a slice of meat, they thought that that would rot in your body. You wouldn't produce enough heat to burn that off. So they had to cook the food a couple more times. So they would roast it, and they'd boil it, and they'd fry it, and they'd give you really refined bread. You would give you boiled vegetables and things of that nature, so you didn't get sick from having food rot in your body. I think a lot of us have had the instance where we eat a big meal and then we're not active afterwards, and it does kind of feel bad if you eat too much and don't take a walk after, or things of that nature. So, I mean, they weren't that far off, believe it or not. Your stomach's obviously at a cauldron, but it is full of acid. And you do have to, go through and break down the food. So it's kind of amazing how they came up with that theory. They also believe that hot spices aid in digestion. So you would have like a hot spice at the end of the meal to close your stomach off. Because if you didn't close your stomach, that boiling, that cauldron would kind of tip over. And much like we actually get acid reflux, they thought that that would cause problems. So this is the humoral chart that I used, and I took this from Terence Scully's article, A Cook's Therapeutic Use of Herb Gardens in Health and Healing in the Medieval Garden. And he has compiled this, and it's really interesting because you see things like really hot and really dry are things like garlic and linseed oil and black pepper and walnut oil, versus onion, which is as hot as you can get and as moist as you can get. So I know this is kind of small because I had to be able to get it to fit on this slide, but there's a larger version in my handouts, which I'll link on the website later today. A couple of really interesting things is, for instance, dry in the first degree and hot in the second degree has mulberry from bushes. However, hot in the second degree but moist in the third degree on the other side of the chart is mulberry from trees. You see things like unripe grapes versus ripe grapes have different humoral values. You have things like an animal in winter versus an animal in spring. You have things like domestic versus wild. So it's really interesting how they believe if you change, kind of where you get the food from or what time of year it was, the humors were different. So that is the last one I have, and then I have several pages of sources, which I'll make available. So I do apologize for the poor audio quality. I'm not quite sure what the issue was. It was working. I mean, I use this computer and this audio all the time, so I'm not quite sure what the problem is. I do apologize, though.
No, we appreciate you taking the time to teach the class. There was a lot of really great information. There's also some really great discussion going on in the chat right now. I don't know if you want to hop over now that you're done with your slides.
Oh, absolutely.
Regarding calorie counting and the stomach is cauldron conversation.
Mm-hmm. The chat is also going to be, when we record these videos, we actually get a chat log. So those will be posted as well. So actually, yes, calorie does come from the word, it's from heat, it's kilocalories. So that is actually really interesting where that comes from. There's also this really interesting poem, and I'd have to dig it up, the Pierce-Plasman poem, that talks about what someone would have, what a poor person would have in their house. And they definitely, oh, my computer could be starting to overheat. That's a good point. And they've discussed about how he only had a couple of foods and access to a pot and things of that nature. So it was really interesting. Is there any other questions or comments? Well, I thank everyone so much for attending my class. I will have a link to this in the, or my handouts and everything in the website later on. And thank you so much.